Hello and welcome to the Week in Parliament. Cleared for takeoff. It's the thumbs up for Heathrow's third runway. But plenty of MPs say the project will never get off the ground.
I believe this will be a millstone around this government's neck for many, many years to come.
Heathrow expansion is neither possible nor deliverable.
It delivers the greatest economic and strategic benefits to our economy.
Boris Johnson isn't likely to be lying down in front of the bulldozers, but if he doesn't agree with the Heathrow plan, shouldn't he have resigned from Theresa May's cabinet?
Losing a foreign secretary in particular, and also one who was so prominent in the Leave campaign, would be very damaging for her government.
And all the world's a stage. Is the Palace of Westminster tailor-made for thespians? An actor turned MP gives her verdict.
I mean, the House of Commons is a theatre, let's face it, and you need to be able to get your message across.
But first, the nation's been in the departure lounge for a very long time. But finally, on Tuesday came news, some would say several years late, of just how the government is going to increase Southern England's airport capacity. And the answer is one new runway at Heathrow. Cost £16 billion. Opposition considerable. Heathrow is currently at 98% capacity, handling 480,000 flights a year. The new runway will take that figure to 700,000. The Transport Secretary told MPs what mattered was the country's future economic prospects.
If we do nothing, the cost to our nation is significant, amounting to more than £20 billion over 60 years through delays, fewer flights and passengers having to fly from airports elsewhere. In addition, the wider impacts on our economy are in the region of £30 to £45 billion. That is why the decision we've reached today is so important to the future of our country. We believe that the expansion of Heathrow Airport and the North West Runway scheme, in combination with a significant package of supporting measures on the scale recommended by the Airports Commission, offers the greatest level of benefit to passengers, business, and to help us deliver the broadest possible benefit to the whole of the United Kingdom.
Just what have they been doing for all these months, apart from worrying about splits in the Cabinet and the Foreign Secretary throwing himself in front of the bulldozers and former mayoral candidates triggering by-elections? There is no justification for dithering on this scale.
I believe this decision is misguided and not ultimately in the nation's interests. Will the Secretary of State assure me, in the consultation scrutiny to come, there will be good and adequate scientific data, because the evidence will show Heathrow expansion is neither possible nor deliverable. In the Minister's words, not expansion at any cost. This is the wrong scheme and the price is too high.
Why is the government disregarding widespread hostility and bulldozing through a third runway, which will inflict crippling noise, significant climate change effects, health-damaging air pollution and catastrophic congestion on 1 million Londoners?
Zach Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has chosen a course that is not only wrong, it's doomed. It's wrong because of the million people who will directly suffer on the back of the environmental harm this project unavoidably produces, and doomed because the complexities, the costs, the legal complications mean that this project is almost certainly not going to be delivered. I believe this will be a millstone around this government's neck for many, many years to come. Constant source of delay, constant source of anger and betrayal.
Isn't the biggest loser from the Tory civil war over Heathrow not the Foreign Secretary nor the member for Richmond Park, but transport everywhere else? Because for over 5 years there's been an obsessive focus on London and the South East. So while welcoming this decision, can I ask the Home Counties-based Cabinet to listen to what William Hague has said today and set out in the autumn statement a clear timetable for HS3 linking Manchester Airport to the great cities of the north?
This is a devastating decision, I think, for the national economic interest, as well as for my constituents, hundreds of whose homes would be bulldozed, and for the millions of people affected by the very loud noise from Heathrow Airport.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on this announcement and make clear to him the relief with which this will be received, this somewhat overdue statement by all the people represented by colleagues in the Gatwick Coordination Group.
I don't share this cosy consensus on airport expansion. Half the population each year doesn't fly for environmental reasons. I haven't flown for several years. The Secretary of State today says this expansion will, quote, further reduce carbon emissions, unquote. What a joke. Because of climate change, the government should not be in the business of encouraging people to fly and more air freight, let alone subsidising increased airport capacity and higher total emissions. I urge the Secretary of State and the government to think again.
Some moments from the Commons on Tuesday. Well, soon after that debate, Zac Goldsmith announced he was quitting as Conservative MP for Richmond Park. There'll now be a by-election there on December the 1st. Zac Goldsmith says he'll be an independent candidate, no doubt hoping to intensify the case against the Heathrow runway plan. Two other West London MPs, Boris Johnson and Justin Greening, also have strong objections to Heathrow expansion. They're being allowed to oppose government policy and yet remain in the cabinet. In other words, the principle of collective responsibility will not apply to them. That follows David Cameron's decision this year to allow several cabinet ministers to agree to disagree with his policy for Britain to stay in the EU. They were allowed to campaign for Brexit. And I'm joined in the studio now by Dr. Catherine Haddon of the Institute for Government, who's an expert on collective responsibility. Welcome to the programme. Now, first, a word of introduction about this notion of collective responsibility. Where does it actually come from? What's the origin of the term?
It comes from the 18th century, really, and it's all about the sort of development of parliamentary democracy and executive governments in relation to the Crown. So its development there was largely to keep the government together, and they're all on the same page in terms of what they were presenting to the monarch. What they were saying was policy, and making sure they weren't getting blindsided on issues. But obviously it's evolved a lot over the years since then.
So originally it was to avoid the king picking somebody out.
Yes, exactly. But in a way, the origins there, although obviously we don't have the same need for it in that way, it still tells us a lot about its value, because it's really about binding the government together. So, as I say, they're all on the same page. They're all sort of in the same boat, to use another metaphor. They're trying to make sure that they're working together as a collective. So it's not really just about sort of signing up to particular policies or anything like that. It's more about the cohesion of governments more generally.
Two suspensions, in a sense, significant suspensions in 2016, firstly on the EU referendum and now on Heathrow. So does that suggest that maybe the principle isn't quite so fundamental as it once was? We could see it being suspended more often in future.
As with all things in our constitution, you know, they're sort of bound in. It's bound into the ministerial code, but they evolve over time depending on how people view them and how strongly they sort of adhere to them. You know, you can go back over hundreds of years. You could certainly over the last century, seeing all sorts of times at which cabinet ministers would leak, would brief, would sort of hint at whether or not they were happy with the proposal that went through, or just keep quiet about it and not necessarily be the proponent that leads on that particular policy.
Because the sort of counterweight to collective responsibility, if you don't agree with a government policy, the noble British tradition is you resign. And Michael Heseltine famously resigned over Westland and the Iraq War. We saw John Denham resigning and Robin Cook. And that, in a sense, could have happened this time with Boris Johnson, and Justin Greening could have resigned over the Heathrow announcement.
Yeah, and so taken in isolation, you can see why May wanted to do it, why she called it a sort of mature decision on this point, because losing a foreign secretary in particular, and also one who was so prominent in the Leave campaign, would be very damaging for her government. In isolation, you can see it as sort of a mature thing, but taken alongside the fact that we've had such a large split in the country between the sort of Remain and Leave camps, and we're still seeing the legacy of that, it's more than what it suggests about May's ability to hold the government together. If she needs more and more of these, that isn't a suggesting of a sort of mature government, it suggests a fractured government.
But I suppose the public might think that this collective responsibility notion is a little bit like fantasy world, because they do like to see politicians disagreeing, because the idea that 100 ministers all agree totally on every policy detail must strike some people as being a little bit false. So maybe it's realistic to suspend collective responsibility. I
think there's a difference between suspending collective cabinet responsibility and being aware of and showing the fact that there are different views in governments. Certainly some have talked about whether or not it would humanise politics in that way, but But the reverse side of it is that actually you would see more opportunities for ministers wanting to say why they disagree with what's going on, more fractured debates, more briefing against each other, and also trying to sell each other out in terms of whose decision it was and therefore who should be responsible when it all goes wrong.
So it could be a recipe for pretty chaotic government?
It could be, especially if people aren't willing to then be accountable for it in Parliament, which is another reason why it's important, so that Parliament can hold the government to account collectively.
Dr. Catherine Haddon. The Liberal Democrats are planning to make the coming by-election in Richmond Park a vote on Brexit. And talking of plans and talking of Brexit, Jeremy Corbyn was keen on Wednesday to label as shambolic the government's approach so far to taking the UK out of the EU. At Prime Minister's questions, the Labour leader quoted the remarks of the First Minister of Wales that had followed Monday's Downing Street meeting between Theresa May and all the UK's devolved leaders.
The First Minister for Wales, Carwyn Jones, said there is a great deal of uncertainty, but they are clear they need full and unfettered access to the single market. Can the Prime Minister help the First Minister of Wales, and indeed the other devolved administrations, by giving them some clarity?
There are those who talk about means and those who talk about ends. I'm talking about ends. What we want to see is the best possible arrangement for trade with and operation within the single European market for businesses in goods and services here in the United Kingdom.
Jeremy Corbyn. On Monday, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister told the House, and I quote, "We have a plan which is not to set out at every stage of the negotiation the details." I've been thinking about this for a couple of days, Mr. Speaker, and I think when you're searching for the real meaning behind and the importance behind the Prime Minister's statement, you have to consult the great philosophers. The only one I can come up with.
Mr. Cleverly, calm yourself. You're imperiling your own health, man, which is a source of great concern to me. Jeremy Corbyn.
What I can come up with, Mr. Speaker, is Baldrick, who says our cunning plan is to have no plan. Brexit was apparently about taking back control. But the devolved governments don't know the plan, businesses don't know the plan, Parliament doesn't know the plan. When will the Prime Minister abandon this shambolic Tory Brexit and develop a plan that delivers for the whole country?
We're going to deliver the best possible deal for trade in goods and services, both with and operation within the European Union. And we're going to deliver an end to free movement. That's what the British people want, and that's what this government's going to deliver for them.
Theresa May doing battle with Jeremy Corbyn. Now look at some of the other stories in Parliament in the last few days. Peers have given initial approval to the bill that brings in a scheme for young people called the National Citizen Service. It allows 15 to 17-year-olds to learn new skills and take part in outdoor activities.
I want to give credit to members in other parties who have embraced the scheme. It would have been very easy when this scheme was very much the personal vision of one Prime Minister from one party, for other parties to want to stay clear of it, and indeed a potential different government to want to change it. And I pay particular credit to the noble Lord Blunkett for the part he's played.
When I was 16, I volunteered to go and see an old lady called Mrs. Plum, and I used to go every week in term time until 2 years later I was leaving the School for the Blind and going back to Sheffield, and I went to tell Mrs. Plum that I hoped I'd been some help to her over the 2 years. And as soon as I told her I was returning to Sheffield, her response was, well, David, I really hope I've been some use to you over the last 2 years.
The end of the jungle. The huge refugee camp at Calais is demolished and its occupants are dispersed. Some unaccompanied child refugees travel to Britain. The Home Secretary updates MPs.
We will prioritise those likely to be granted refugee status in the UK. We will also prioritise those 12-year-olds or under, and we will consider those assessed as being at a high risk of sexual exploitation.
Can she reassure the House that before any child is admitted, every receiving family will be properly screened, and in the interest of national security, that every young adult admitted to the United Kingdom is screened before they're allowed to come into the country.
We will always make the correct safeguarding checks, and we will always make sure that the families are prepared. We will not take any risks for this country.
The link between property and dodgy money. The Commons approves a bill that cracks down on money laundering and the financing of terrorists.
But we must recognise that the size of our financial sector and open economy and the attractiveness of London property market to overseas investors makes this country unusually exposed to the risks of international money laundering.
Some of the most expensive properties in the capital are unoccupied because they have been bought solely for the purpose of laundering dirty money.
Property in London has become one of the safest investments in the world, and one which rich criminals and money launderers are attracted to in just the same way as people who have made their money legitimately.
And that programme again, as 14.8 million viewers tune in to the final of the Great British Bake Off, MPs refocus on the wisdom of the programme's planned move to Channel 4. Is the plan half-baked?
Do you accept, for example, that some of the programmes that we all enjoy, some of us enjoy, Unreported World, for example, an hour-long Channel 4 news, Dispatches, the Paralympics,
Bake Off?
Not so much, perhaps, but these are the kind of the programmes that clearly would not thrive, almost certainly, under privatised Channel 4 for the very obvious reason. Advertisers don't really want, do they, to advertise in the middle of Unreported World. It's not sexy.
Those programmes do not generate enough advertising revenue in themselves in order for them to succeed, which is Ms McCarthy's point about Bake Off. The point Channel 4 have made to me about Bake Off is this is the biggest programme with no adverts on it at all in the world. Now, the advertising revenue that potentially Channel 4 could receive from showing Bake Off may well pay in itself for the Paralympics, for Dispatches, for Unreported World.
Karen Bradley. Well, staying with television for a moment, one of the two new MPs to enter the Commons this week was the new member for Batley and Spen in West Yorkshire. Tracy Brabin easily won the by-election on October the 20th. One of Tracy Brabin's claims to fame before reaching Westminster was her many appearances playing Trisha Armstrong in Coronation Street. So is performing as an actor in a TV soap opera good preparation for being a politician? The Scottish nationalist Deirdre Brock was an actor in Australia who made some appearances in Home and Away. So I asked her, was she pleased that another former soap actor was now joining the House of Commons?
I hadn't thought about it. I certainly don't think of myself as a soap actor, to tell you the truth. I had 2 days' work on Home and Away in a 10-year career, but that seems to be the thing that sticks in people's memory.
But you're a distinguished actor. I'm sure we can call you that.
It's 20 years ago now. It's a long time ago. I did train. I trained for 3 years full-time at a drama school, and before that did a Bachelor of Arts in English.
Now, do you think there is an overlap between acting and being a politician?
Well, I think there are definitely skills that carry over. I mean, the House of Commons is a theatre, let's face it, and you need to be able to get your message across. So if you're not able to speak up, if you lose the attention of the House, of course, it means that your message isn't getting out there. So the message you're trying to get out there on behalf of your constituents is not penetrating, and that's, I think, a really important part of it. Certainly in hustings, for example, in politics, I had people come up to me in hustings saying that I was the only person they could hear of all the candidates. I thought that was probably quite helpful. But you do need to have a sense of projecting. Being able to project your voice, I think, is actually quite a helpful skill.
And when you're making a speech in the Commons, do you actually have that sort of slight feeling, I'm an actor again?
A little bit, I suppose I do. There is an attempt to project what you're saying. I do tend to take that extra breath as I stand up just to make sure my posture is good, and it's not something that I do consciously, to be honest with you, after all the training and the work in the field. It's just something that comes naturally.
And when you're watching other MPs speaking in the Commons, do you ever think to yourself, that person will make a good actor?
No, I watch sometimes people in the House of Commons and think they need acting lessons, really. Just in terms of, as I said before, trying to get that message out there, because what they're saying can be fantastic, but if they're reading it off a page and they're doing it in a sort of fairly monotonal voice, for example, sort of low level, like I say, you're just not getting that message out there, and I think that's all part of the package.
And I suppose you'll be interested to see how Tracy Brabin projects herself when she speaks.
I saw her briefly in the after she had been announced as the winner of that particular by-election, and I thought she dealt very well with some of the heckling that was going on, so it probably augurs well for her career in the Parliament.
And I think we can say Westminster, perhaps the biggest soap opera of them all.
Yes, you could put it like that. Sometimes it feels like it.
Deirdre Brock, thanks very much indeed for joining us on The Week in Parliament.
Thanks for having me.
Deirdre Brock. Councils are being urged to do more to prevent people from becoming homeless. A Conservative MP has put forward his homelessness reduction bill. As he says, the current rules on who is regarded as homeless are inadequate. His bill would mean councils having to find more properties for people at risk of becoming homeless. At the moment, he said, there are strict criteria for who qualifies as homeless.
The non-priority homeless are told, go out, sleep on the streets, sleep on a park bench or in a doorway, and you may be picked up by a charity under the No Second Night Out programme. That, to me, Mr Speaker, is an absolute national disgrace. At a time when we have employment at the highest level ever, a relatively low level of unemployment, a single person sleeping rough on our streets is a national disgrace, and we must combat it.
If the government is serious about this bill, and if ministers mean what they say about homelessness, then they must do two things. Fund the costs of the extra duties in this bill in full, and tackle the causes of the growing homelessness crisis in this country. And those will be the two tests that we on this side will hold the government hard to account.
And research published in February this year has found that 4 in 10 people who sleep rough have a mental health problem. And they're more likely to be stuck sleeping rough for longer than a year. This is a major problem that the bill seeks to address, and clearly early intervention and prevention has the potential to have a positive impact on the lives of these very vulnerable people.
This bill, unfortunately, is a classic piece of wishful thinking. It's gesture politics of the worst kind. You will the ends, but you don't provide the means. You make yourself feel good because you've voted and the pressure groups and campaigns have pressed you to do it. You vote for something because it sounds good. It says homelessness reduction. It should not be called homelessness reduction. It should be called Homelessness Recognition Bill.
Now, with a roundup of some of the week's other political stories, here's Kate Wannell.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Prime Minister Theresa May began the week by welcoming leaders of the devolved nations to Downing Street to discuss Brexit. But some of her guests left somewhat dissatisfied.
In parts, the meeting was deeply frustrating. I don't know any more now about the UK government's approach to the EU negotiation than I did before I went into the meeting.
MP Helen Goodman had serious concerns about the dwindling love life of our feathered friends.
They sing for so long that they don't have any energy left to mate.
But a fit of the giggles left her unable to finish her question. Now, that rare thing, a Scottish Labour victory. Kezia Dugdale was awarded Politician of the Year at the Pink News Awards. The Scottish Labour leader came out earlier this year and is engaged to her long-term partner. In Strasbourg, UKIP acting leader Nigel Farage clears up confusion over what took place between 2 of his MEPs.
There is absolutely no evidence that anybody was punched at all, and I do want that put on the record. However, if you would like to come outside with me, we could have a civilised conversation over a cup of coffee. Thank you.
Last week, Schiphol Airport sent a cake to Heathrow to celebrate another delayed decision on airport expansion. This week, the government announced a third runway would go ahead, and Heathrow was able to return the favour. Touché!
Kate Wonnell collecting some interesting morsels. Some significant debates coming up in the next few days. Expect some fallout from the decision of the car maker Nissan to build its latest models in the northeast of England. So do join me for the next Week in Parliament. Until then, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.